Welcome to the 11th episode of 2 Cents Tuesday. This week, I want to look at the workings of our parliament and also at what transpired last week during the debate on the estimates of revenue and expenditure. Our parliament, in fact, any parliament that is based on the Westminster model, has four primary responsibilities. First, to check and challenge the work of the government. Second, to make and change laws. Third, to debate the important issues of the day. And fourth, to check and approve government spending. All four of these are very important responsibilities. Most importantly, the Parliament has an overarching responsibility to represent the interests of the citizens of the country by providing a forum where these interests and concerns can be spoken about and debated by the men and women, the members of Parliament, whom the people have entrusted with that responsibility. The first role of checking and challenging the work of government can be done in several ways. One way is by posing questions to the government ministers in Parliament. Some parliaments, such as the British Parliament, have set times and days for the posing of questions to ministers and to the Prime Minister. Question time, and in particular, Prime Minister question time, is an important and highly anticipated part of the work of the British Parliament and many other parliaments. Standing Order 14 of St. Lucia's House of Assembly allows for questions to be posed to any minister relating to any subject or department with the responsibility which he or she has been charged. Unfortunately, this facility to question ministers and the Prime Minister in our House of Assembly is very seldom used. The other way in which Parliament can check and challenge the work of government is through select committees. Select committees are groups of members of Parliament that look at specific policy issues or legislation in more detail than would be possible in a full meeting of the House of Assembly. These select committees are expected to report back to the House of Assembly on their findings and recommendations. Our standing orders make provision for 5 standing select committees: the Public Accounts Committee, the Standing Orders Committee, the House Committee, the Committee of Privileges, and the Regulations Committee. If you follow the proceedings of our Parliament closely, you will hear at the first sitting of Parliament after a general election, the Speaker asks both sides of the House for nominees to sit on the standing select committees. What you very seldom hear, however, at any subsequent sittings of the House is the result of the deliberations of these House committees, for the very simple reason that they seldom meet. In the case of the Public Accounts Committee, this is very unfortunate. The Public Accounts Committee has the responsibility to, first of all, examine the accounts of the various government agencies for which approval was granted by Parliament during the presentation of the annual budget. Secondly, to assess any other accounts that may be referred to it by the House of Assembly or any existing legislation. And thirdly, to review the report of the Director of Audit on government accounts. The Public Accounts Committee is largely dysfunctional in St. Lucia and has been that way for years. This robs the Parliament of a very important organ to ensure that the executive is effectively, efficiently, and prudently managing the funds that have been allocated to it. Parliament is failing in its important responsibility to provide the checks and balances on government spending and use of money. But that is not surprising for a reason that I will come to very shortly. The House of Assembly also has the ability to set up departmental select committees that would allow Parliament to shadow government departments and scrutinize the spending, administration, and policy direction of these departments. Sadly, these committees are never established. And again, Parliament routinely fails in its responsibility to oversee the operations of government departments and agencies. However, none of these things should come as a surprise, because most of the members on the government side of the House of Assembly are also ministers of government. Therefore, for them to faithfully fulfill and discharge their duties as parliamentarians would require them to sit in Parliament and check and challenge their own operations as ministers. In these circumstances, you can hardly expect to see enthusiasm on the part of the government members of Parliament to subject their own actions as ministers to scrutiny in the House of Assembly. Even if they did, would we be convinced that they would approach that task with the sincerity and rigor that it demanded? I know I wouldn't. The second primary role of Parliament is to make and change laws. This is the function with which we are most familiar, because it is what most often occupies the attention of the members of our Parliament. Any member of Parliament is allowed to seek the permission of the House to introduce a bill. I repeat, any member of Parliament. A bill, except one that deals with matters of a financial nature, or as it is called, a money bill, may also be introduced in the Senate and then sent to the House of Assembly for debate. In all my years following the proceedings of our Parliament, and also my 5 years spent in the Senate, I cannot recall one occasion when a bill was presented by anyone other than a minister of government, and certainly never by a member of the opposition or a member of the Senate. Because bills that will change or introduce new laws will have an impact on the lives of citizens, the member of Parliament introducing the bill should always ensure that there was adequate consultation with all relevant stakeholders within the general population, and not just in the public service or the government. On many occasions, we have seen bills tabled in Parliament that have not been subjected to scrutiny or sufficient consultation, in fact, any consultation by the general public. Enough time should be allowed between the first reading of the bill, which is when it is tabled in the House of Assembly, and the second reading, which is when it is debated, to permit all members of Parliament time to read it thoroughly, time to consult with their constituents and other interest groups, and also time for the general public who may have concerns over the provisions, or some of the provisions of the bill, to express these concerns to their respective members of Parliament or to the government department that is responsible for the bill. However, for this to happen, every bill that is before the House of Assembly must be made available and accessible to the general public. How often is this done? This must change. The third primary function of Parliament is to debate the important issues of the day, the things that are impacting the lives of our citizens and are affecting the development trajectory of our country. Section 21 of the Standing Orders of the House of Assembly allows, and I quote, any member to propose by way of motion any matter for debate in the House, end of quote. The exception is motions that deal with financial matters. Again, this provision to cause debates to take place on important issues is seldom used in our House of Assembly. All the motions that are debated in our Parliament arise from the government side and almost never involve a matter that one or more MPs have deemed to be of sufficient importance to warrant a debate in the highest lawmaking body in our country. Without being prompted or provoked by an accompanying bill, how many general debates have we seen in the House of Assembly on gender-based violence, food security, water security, the rising cost of living, unemployment, the state of our economy, the plight of our homeless, or the worsening impacts of climate change and extreme weather events? Is it that our MPs do not see these issues as worthy of debate in the House of Assembly? Or is it that our government MPs do not have the time to engage in those debates in the House because they are so busy fulfilling their responsibilities as ministers? Whatever the reason, our democracy is being shortchanged because our citizens are not getting an opportunity to hear the men and women whom they voted to represent their interests, debate the issues that seriously impact their lives and livelihoods. The final function of Parliament is to check and approve government spending. Every year, the Minister for Finance presents the estimates of revenue and expenditure in the House of Assembly and seeks approval from Parliament to raise revenue and to spend money across the various agencies of government. In St. Lucia, this budget exercise is separated into two parts. The first part is a debate on the estimates of revenue and expenditure, which is the actual budget, the numbers that represent the revenue that will be collected locally through taxes and import duties and raised through grants and loans, and the expenses that the government will incur throughout the year in the various public service departments and agencies. This is what took place last week in our House of Assembly. The second part of the debate, which will soon follow, is the debate on the Appropriation Bill, which is the bill, the piece of legislation that will authorize the use of monies from the Consolidated Fund to cover the expenditure under the various heads that the House of Assembly approved in the estimates of revenue and expenditure. The presentation of the Appropriation Bill is accompanied by a statement from the Minister for Finance on the financial and economic state of the country and the broad policy directions that his government will pursue in the coming financial year. The budget that is presented by the Minister for Finance is a consolidation of the submissions of the various government agencies to the Ministry of Finance, submissions made by the respective ministers, refined by the technocrats in the Ministry of Finance, and debated and discussed by the Cabinet of Ministers in several meetings with the technical officers of the Ministry of Finance over a period of weeks and sometimes even months. So, when the members of Parliament on the government side meet in the House of Assembly to debate the estimates, they are debating a budget that they largely helped to develop and on which they signed off as a cabinet. This is why the only real debate you get on the budget comes from the opposition members of Parliament, who naturally were not involved in the formulation of the budget, and from any government backbenchers, those government MPs who do not hold ministerial portfolio. In this case, Honorable Dr. Kenny Anthony and Honorable Jeremiah Norbert, who did not take part in the development of the budget. This incestuous relationship between the executive, represented by the cabinet, and the parliament, caused by our interpretation of the Westminster model, has emasculated our parliament and constrained its ability to exercise its important responsibility to provide objective oversight and critical review of the management of public funds by the executive, the Cabinet of Ministers. Our democracy is poorer for this. Unfortunately, this will continue as long as our governments continue to view the work of the parliament as secondary to that of the cabinet, and the role of the member of parliament, the MP, as less important than the role of the cabinet minister. An elected member of parliament who is not a minister makes a monthly salary of $5,158. A cabinet minister, except the prime minister, on the other hand, makes a base monthly salary of $12,895. The leader of the opposition receives a salary equal to that of a cabinet minister. This means that the salary of a cabinet minister is 2.5 times that of an elected MP who does not hold a ministerial portfolio. Does it come as any surprise, therefore, that the MPs whom the voters elected to office spend 4 days a week in their ministry and only 1 day a week in their constituency office attending to the concerns of the people who voted them into office on election day? This is wrong. From everything I've said earlier about the important role of the parliament, you should realize that there is more than enough work to keep every member of parliament occupied every day of the week, between his or her parliamentary duties and his or her obligations to constituents. This is why I believe that we need to get our parliament to function in the manner in which it was intended and to compensate our members of parliament in a manner that is consistent with their responsibilities. On election day, the voters cast their ballots for the person they felt best capable of representing their interests, not the person best capable of holding a ministry. I believe our present system is denying the voters the level of representation for which they voted, and this must be addressed. This will call for changes in our system of local government. Members of parliament must be given an institutional structure at the constituency level and a group of competent people to manage the affairs of the constituency and the funds that have been allocated by government to that constituency. A member of parliament should not have to be constantly begging a minister for assistance to undertake small projects in his or her constituency. But that is what happens now. And that is why every MP wants to be a minister. Some responsibilities must be devolved to the local government level. The final issue I want to touch on is the situation that arose in the House of Assembly last week, where the leader of the opposition, the Minister for Commerce, the Minister for External Affairs, the Minister for Infrastructure, and the Minister for Housing did not get to make their presentations during the debate on the estates. Apparently, this stemmed from the leader of the opposition allegedly absenting himself from the House of Assembly so that he could get to speak last, just before the Prime Minister summed up the debate. This prompted the government to call a premature end to the debate before everyone had an opportunity to speak. First of all, it is impolite for members of parliament to deliberately absent themselves from the House chamber when they are not speaking. There is no reason other than an emergency or the need for a bathroom break for a member of parliament to be outside of the House chamber when an important debate is taking place. It is discourteous and an abdication of the responsibility to the people who voted that member of parliament into office and whose taxes are paying the salary of the member of parliament. It is the equivalent of slacking off on the job. The Parliament office is always very generous with its catering for the dietary needs of members of parliament during meetings of the House and the Senate. So there is no need to leave the Parliament building to go outside to eat. You were elected and you are being paid to attend Parliament, and this is where you should be when Parliament is in session, unless there is an emergency that requires your presence elsewhere. There can be no exceptions to this rule. Then there's the issue of when the leader of the opposition speaks during the budget debate. The convention in budget debates in mature parliaments is that the leader of the opposition rises to speak after the Minister for Finance has completed his or her presentation. In the same way that the Minister for Finance is given unlimited time to make his or her presentation, the leader of the opposition is also entitled to unlimited time for his or her rebuttal. The leader of the opposition shadows and rebuts the Minister for Finance, who in our case is also the Prime Minister. The leader of the opposition is not expected to speak at the end of the debate to rebut what all the government MPs have said in their contributions. That is not his role. The opposition is expected to have shadow ministers on its benches who rise to speak at various points during the debate on the issues in the estimates that relate to the government agencies that they are shadowing. Unfortunately, the present leader of the opposition has a problem because he has only one other member on his side, so he is not able to muster a workable slate of shadow ministers. But he cannot blame the government for that. It was the people of St. Lucia who decided on election day on the composition of the parliament. And they, in their wisdom, determined that the opposition benches would be populated with only 2 members. What the leader of the opposition could have done in those circumstances was to have a discussion with the leader of government business in the House and asked that he be allowed to speak during prime time on the second day of the debate, that is the day after the Prime Minister and Minister for Finance had made his presentation, which would have allowed the leader of the opposition to rebut the Minister for Finance and whichever other government MPs had spoken by them. However, the leader of the opposition has no authority or right to dictate that he speaks last, and it was most certainly not an attack on democracy to deny that request if in fact he made it. Having said this, if I were the leader of government business, and this is purely a personal observation, on this instance, I would have allowed the leader of the opposition to speak last, so as to not deny 4 of my senior, experienced ministers and members of parliament their ability to make their very important contributions to the debate on the estimates. I would have made it clear, however, to the leader of the opposition that this was a one-time concession, which would never be repeated in the future. As it was, the premature closure of the debate prevented us from hearing contributions from the leader of the opposition and from 4 senior government ministers, 4 senior government MPs. And this, in my opinion, was a lose-lose-lose outcome, with the people of St. Lucia being the biggest losers. But this leads me to an even bigger issue in closing. Members of the House of Assembly are referred to as honorable because they are expected to behave like men and women of honor. Unfortunately, what we sometimes see and hear in the House of Assembly, with 1 or 2 notable exceptions, does not rise to the level of behavior we expect from men and women of honor. Too often, we hear and see heckling and bouts of acrimony that are unbecoming of the highest assembly in our land. This clearly cannot be the standard that we wish our youth to emulate. I know some will tell me that worse things happen in other parliaments, but why must we always use the lowest common denominator as our benchmark, our model, our excuse for bad behavior? Why can't we hold ourselves to a higher level and become the standard bearer that others seek to emulate? For the upcoming debate on the appropriation bill, I hope the 2 sides, government and opposition, can meet amicably prior to the start of the debate and agree on a speaking order that will allow the proceedings of the House to move in a coherent and sensible order, in keeping with normal standards, without the grandstanding and the descent of the proceedings into the equivalent of a child's game of "you go with my lash." Thank you for viewing another 2 Cents Tuesday. Have a safe and productive week.